Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Let me welcome all of you to this Ics conversation on the evolving European perspectives on China in the COVID era, which is being jointly hosted by the Institute of Chinese Studies and Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. We have the print as a media partner. The event is also being live streamed on YouTube. As you can see, we have very impressive panel today. This Ics-Kas conversation will feature three well-known Europe-based sinologists. Actually, I should say two Europe-based sinologists and one Washington-based sinologist. Andrew is based in Washington normally. We have Professor Frank Piquet, a professor of modern Chinese studies at Leiden University. He was until recently director and CEO of the Mercator Institute for China Studies in Berlin. Frank recently wrote a paper for ICS entitled China Through European Eyes, which in fact gave us the idea of holding this webinar. Dr. Andrew Small, a senior transatlantic fellow with German Marshall Fund's Asia program. Andrew is very well known in India for his book, China-Pakistan Axis, Asia's New Geopolitics. And we have Dr. Marieke Olberg, a senior fellow in the German Marshall Fund's Asia program, who also co-leads the Stockholm China Forum. She is co-author of the book, Hidden Hand, How the Communist Party of China is Reshaping the World, which came out recently. And of course, we have a very important person, Dr. Garima Mohan of German Marshall Fund, who will be moderating this dialogue. Frank, Andrew, Marieke, and Garima have all participated in our events in the past, and they bring this formidable expertise and scholarship to this afternoon's dialogue. Welcome all of you. Thank you very much for joining this webinar. This conversation will explore changing European perceptions about China in the wake of the COVID era. Concerns in Europe about China were already on the rise prior to the outbreak of the novel coronavirus. We'll examine whether the pandemic has been a watershed moment in Europe-China relations and what are the elements of cooperation and competition looking ahead. This dialogue will also consider whether European perspectives differ from the emerging perceptions in the Indo-Pacific about China. There's a view in India that Europe is soft on China. As I see it, the outlook in the EU about China has hardened in recent months with a backlash on the issue of China's accountability for COVID-19 becoming a pandemic. At the same time, European countries continue to seek closer engagement with China, avoiding the policies of confrontation or containment. We look forward to getting the insights of our distinguished panelists on how EU is looking at the escalating US-China strategic rivalry and how EU is coping with some troubling aspects of the rise of China and its aggressive behavior. I will now invite Mr. Peter Remele, country head and resident representative in India of our partners, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, to make his remarks. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much. Very distinguished panel, Honorable Ambassador Kante, dear Garima, and ladies and gentlemen. For those of us who have watched the rise of China through the decades, it came as no surprise, maybe for the general public, the rise to prominence, at least in the media of the country, must have seemed meteoric, to say the least. No matter where you turn in the globe, a Chinese presence can be tangibly felt at every corner. And I can say that out of my own experience. Some 10 years ago, I was posted in Rwanda, really in the middle of Africa. On every flight I had to another African country, I was wondering in the departure hall or on the flight whether there were more Chinese passengers than Africans if I'm on a domestic flight in China or if I'm really in Africa. So the presence was even felt on such daily appearances. So when COVID-19 hit us, this presence grew even stronger. The Byzantine nature of the Chinese government, its less than transparent initial reaction to COVID-19, Ambassador Kante just mentioned that, and the apparent Chinese government, its less than transparent reaction in the beginning, and the apparent pressure it exerted on bodies like the World Health Organization squandered what little goodwill the Chinese government had left in the Western world. The image of the Chinese government abroad was catastrophically bad at the onset of the crisis due to its antics in the East and South China Seas, as also its stealthy economic mercantilism. And unlike Russia, that has carved out a role for itself, let's say, as a protector of Western reactionaries, Beijing had not cultivated any natural allies. But the communist giant managed a remarkable turnaround within only a few months. When the divisions that have plagued the European Union for some time now cracked open under the duress of the fight against Corona, China was quick to instrumentalize the opportunity. Chinese breathing masks, medical equipment, and personnel arrived in hard-hit areas across Europe, proclaiming neighborly relations to Italians in Venice. You don't need to have a geography study to know that the proximity of those neighbors is not so great if you look on the globe. The leading Serbian president, Aleksandar Vučić, proclaimed even Europe's solidarity dead in the face of an ostensibly much more helpful China, as it was appearing there. Where we stand now as a continent is probably best left for our panelists to say. I can speak for us as the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. Our mission around the globe is the promotion of values like democracy, a free press, social market economy, and a fair social order that allows for personal freedom and development of the societies. This is contingent on a balanced international order in which all actors, big and small, adhere to international rules and common fairness. We believe in cooperation and in progress through mutual understanding. China can be an important partner, but only if it starts playing by the same rules as we do all globally. International borders can no longer be drawn with a quill on a map. International trade cannot be used as a political bargaining chip. And especially relating to China, the days of gunboat diplomacy are behind us. So the rules are there, they should be obeyed, but we notice more and more that China is trying to change the rules to its own benefit. In India, I hear very often, China is misbehaving. I mean, in my opinion, states are not behaving. States have interests. The matter is how they present those interests to the international world and how they get their interests settled in cooperation with others, or what I hear in India is very often called misbehavior. I think China will not change its attitude. We rather should study the interests and then look how can we react to that. Whenever we deal with the dragon of the East, we have to remember that we are facing an authoritarian behemoth with a drastically different outlook on the future of the world order. It is neither a market economy, nor is it democratic or even a nation state. In every interaction with it, hostile or not, we are facing a systemic challenge to some of our core beliefs. We cannot compartmentalize our dealings with China because China does not differentiate between politics, diplomacy, trade, and economy, and maybe neither should we. I want to argue on behalf of a cooperative but robust policy, a holistic approach. In the spirit of international understanding, we need to find common solutions where possible, but should always remain steadfast in our beliefs and positions. To stand strong, we need to stand together. So it is especially important to broaden the field of potential partners, and that is our topic today. India and Europe share values and aims that should suffice to put us in a close working relationship We both believe in democracy, the rule of law, as well as rules-based multilateral world order, the like-minded we speak of all the time. Europe, as well as India, are interested in maintaining the current multilateral order. We both wish to see the Indo-Pacific remain an international sea, and influence in the regions bordering it to be balanced. The latest turbulences at the Sino-Indian border have put yet another question mark on all the values that we hold dear. I believe cooperation should come naturally to us. It's no secret that we as a foundation wish to see a strengthening of Indo-German and European-Indian relations. Together, India and Europe would be able to provide a much-needed counterweight to growing Chinese power in the Indo-Pacific. Together, India and Europe could work to compensate, I say, at least a part or to some degree for the inevitable vacuum that would be created in the regional security architecture by the American withdrawal from Afghanistan. Again, together, we could bring a new impetus to the international fight against terrorism that threatens our way of life. I have talked about some of the core values of our foundation already. These values are shared between Germany, European Union, and India. To promote them means to foster a better, deeper, and broad-based understanding between our countries. And I believe we can all agree that a deepened understanding, even leading to some kind of more formalized cooperation, is in all of our interest if we want to face an already arisen, and maybe a year ago I would have said more assertive China. Today I would formulate a more aggressive China. So I hope our event today can contribute to that, and I thank you for your attention. I'll hand back to Ambassador Kanto or to Garima, whoever takes over now.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much for those very thoughtful remarks. What you said about the Chinese behavior, your characterization of China's present behavior. Also, very positive sentiments expressed by you with regard to a closer India, Germany, and India-EU partnership. Thank you for those remarks. Shortly, I'll hand over to Garima to conduct the rest of the proceedings of this afternoon. Before I invite Garima to take over, let me explain some ground rules very briefly. For the first 30 minutes or so of this conversation, Garima will have a dialogue with 3 panelists, and at that time we'll mute all other participants. Thereafter, we'll have the question and answer session involving other participants. You may indicate your interest in asking questions to the panelists by using the raise hand option, which is available at the bottom of the list of participants. Alternatively, you can do that through the chat option. You can convey your interest in asking question by either writing a question or just saying that you would like to ask a question in the chat box. Garima will call on participants to raise their questions. The concerned participant will unmute himself or herself. Other participants are requested to keep themselves muted. Now, I'll hand over to Garima to do rest of the heavy lifting for this afternoon. Over to you, Garima.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're sitting. Many thanks to the Institute for Chinese Studies and the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for hosting this event. And very nice to see a lot of familiar faces that we usually see once a year at the ICS event in Goa. But thanks to the coronavirus pandemic, we can actually see each other virtually and not just once a year. So the topic of today's panel, as mentioned by Ambassador Kanta, is to analyze whether the coronavirus crisis represents an inflection point in Europe-China relations. We have an excellent panel with us today. I will dive straight into the first question and start with Frank. The coronavirus crisis has led to an interesting debate in Europe about the role of China. On top of the various Europe-China issues that already existed, there is a new layer of looking at China as a player in disinformation. whether it is regarding the origin of the virus or the European response to the virus. Chinese reactions have raised a few eyebrows in Brussels. We've had very strong statements from the EU's top diplomat Borrell, who argued that Europe has been naive on China, that perhaps we need to reconsider our China strategy. What I find quite interesting is that a lot of these debates are talking about Russia and China together when it comes to disinformation as posing threats to European integrity and security, which is a fairly new development. The rest of us have seen China's wolf warrior diplomacy. Europeans got a taste of it in this crisis. Do you think, therefore, that perhaps the coronavirus situation represents a watershed moment in Europe-China relations, or is it being exaggerated and we'll go back to normal once things abate? Over to you, Frank. I think you'll have to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Oh, right. Yeah. Okay. No, I was muted by you. That's why. I think it's a little bit a little bit of both. It is indeed a watershed moment in the sense that it has opened many people's eyes in Europe about China's true nature, and also actually the changes in China's true nature, which are progressing very rapidly now in the direction of genuine superpower behavior with all the ugly aspects that has, and that we are familiar with the US and also in the past with the Soviet Union. On the other hand, the issues that divide Europe and China are actually not new. They have been discussed over the last 10, 5, 3, 2, 1 years in various degrees of aggression, but they are now increasingly being seen in terms of a sharp dichotomy. In the past, we were more attuned to think about China as having a lot of problems for us, but also a lot of opportunities. And we want to take a measured approach by looking at some of them in a positive light, a way where we can deal with China. But then other issues we found that we had problems with and we had to deal with in another more confrontational way, perhaps. And now you see a tendency to look at the whole thing as a package and to say, well, China is misbehaving in many different areas, and the time has passed that we can try to parse that, as it were. Yesterday, there was day before yesterday, there was an EU-China summit online. And in her press statement after that, Ursula von der Leyen, the EC chair, she started out by saying the relationship with the European Union and China is simultaneously one of the most strategically important and one of the most challenging that we have. Now that's a very sort of sharp statement from somebody who's still, she's a politician of course, but she's also a diplomat. And then we get a whole litany of things that are wrong and where China and Europe don't see eye to eye. And there is no talk at all about anything that was achieved during that summit. So it is very clear that the relationship between China and Europe is going in a direction of more confrontation, less politeness also, and quite frankly also more in the direction of the United States. Now, we may like that or we may not like that, doesn't matter, really, it is a fact. 10 days ago, I was also speaking to the Dutch Prime Minister and the Cabinet about China, and there were two sentiments that were really palpable in the room. And mind you, Holland is one of the most sort of pro-trade, pro-internationalism, pro-globalization countries imaginable. But there was a clear sentiment, first of all, that globalization has come to an end because of the corona crisis and things that happened before. And we should repatriate value change to Europe, which is an American thing, I would say, to say. And now you hear this also from ministries in the Netherlands. And secondly, that indeed we can't deal with China anymore in terms of expecting goodwill, but we should really be prepared to take China on head on. Exactly how to do that is, of course, a completely different thing. But the whole tenor of the discussion was very hawkish and very confrontational. And I should also say, and this is an issue that hasn't yet been raised yet, but it is really important, The corona crisis has also not only sharpened the differences between China and Europe, but also has eroded even further any belief that people in Europe have about the European Union. The way that countries have very quickly during the pandemic closed their borders, have only batted for their own team, as it were. Also the way that China was able to play apart some of the European countries by sometimes in mid-air rerouting flights with medical supplies from one country to another because they got more political concessions from that latter country. All of these things have created a great deal of distress and cynicism about European unity. And what people are really asking themselves now is, okay, we still have to bet in Europe. It's the only real card we have. We have to work together. But is it really going to happen? Is it really possible? But what are then the alternatives? Should we then look more to our transatlantic partners? We can't trust them either, particularly not to the current president. And you feel a slight sense of despair. They don't quite know what to do. They don't have a plan. They know they have to do something, but there is not a clear route that they can travel along that will get them the desired results.
Thanks, Frank. I think you've laid the stage well. I'll move on to Andrew and ask you to respond to some of the things Frank said, but you've also written a piece recently exactly on this topic, on coronavirus crisis and how it can actually lead to almost a reset of Europe-China relations. You mentioned that perceptions that Europe had of Beijing that were already crumbling have now perhaps collapsed altogether. Can you elaborate a little bit on what are the issues of interest? What are the issues that Europe is looking at when it comes to China? And second, do you agree with when Frank says that the tenor of the debate in Europe is becoming quite hawkish, and a lot of the points that Europeans are bringing up are similar to the US? And in fact, the crisis has exposed very real fault lines in European unity. What is your take on these points?
Thanks, Grim, and thanks to ICS and Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for the chance to join this discussion today. So I mean, generally speaking, I think the EU has come a long way. Europe in general has come a very long way in its thinking on China, particularly in the last 18 months, in a way that's certainly been accelerated by the behavior that we've seen from China through the pandemic, but as Frank somewhat laid out, is something that's been playing out over a longer period of time. And we're now really seeing this process playing out with a kind of certain political logic to it that's starting to unfold a lot more quickly as a result of the pandemic. But I think in one way, the most important shift has been this recognition that Peter kind of talked about at the beginning as well. This recognition, particularly from the European business community, and driven quite notably by Germany's BDI, of the kind of systemic nature of the competition or rivalry with China that's now underway. That yes, China will remain an important market, of course, but the growing authoritarianism under Xi Jinping, the subordination of the economy to national security and ideological objectives, and so on, is not just a set of kind of values questions that can be pursued in a sort of discrete human rights box while commercial ties are then continue unaltered in the same framework. It basically requires a pretty fundamental rebalancing of how the EU responds internally, bilaterally, globally, in kind of basically all dimensions. And I think the thing that's important about this is a lot of this is not really about China policy as such at all. And I think sometimes in terms of trying to understand what the EU is doing about China, that can be this kind of fixation on what the EU says and does about a kind of classic China issue set, or the bilateral summits and things. But I think what you've had a view evolving on the European side, which is which one certainly sees in the US as well, that a lot of the major dimensions of competition with China are going to be about economic, technological, and regulatory power, and that you need to essentially be able to kind of mobilize new instruments and resources to be able to deal with this much more seriously. To take the Belt and Road as a really obvious example, you can use all the strong language and coercive tools that you like, but if your industry can't compete with China's telecoms and technology offer, if you can't mobilize alternative infrastructure and development financing effectively, if you can't take on Chinese subsidies in third markets, if you can't bind countries into your model of trade, data, standards, then the balance of power in the world, the international security environment, the values and norms that are there are all going to shift in an adverse direction. And the big challenge really on the EU side is not just therefore about the kind of China policy dimensions as such. It's can the EU start really using the power of its market and the economic resources it has at its disposal to take on this kind of strategic challenge that China represents. And I do think yes, there have been failures in the last period of time, and yes, there have been difficulties, but you have seen quite a lot of important shifts in the last couple of years in this regard. I think a lot of the moves that you've seen have been as much on the kind of almost like defensive instruments, ways of constraining China's capacity to take advantage of the openness of the European economy, the moves we've seen on investment screening, on trade enforcement, on procurement, on 5G, and the thing that we actually saw last week, which in some ways was even more important than the EU-China summit itself, these very striking proposals that we saw on competition policy that the EU issued, which, I mean, competition policy is, as Microsoft, Google, and others know, really one of the most powerful tools that the EU has, but was never deployed in a serious way to deal with Chinese practices before. And it's something that the US, for instance, still hasn't even really attempted to try to do. I think you've seen a lot of progress on the kind of internal self-strengthening agenda, industrial policy agenda, and things. And I think this really major departure point that the EU's recovery plan represents. I think one of the biggest problems for ensuring a coherent China policy in the EU over the last decade was the kind of north-south divides that followed the Eurozone crisis. If we get this recovery plan through, if we get the new EU budget through, that would really quite radically change that kind of the intra-European bargain as a result. We'll see whether the Dutch, for instance, are in the end willing to sign up to this. And I think the EU has also, during what has been really a clear, very difficult period of time for global trade, continued to push ahead very rapidly with a lot of these FTAs, and in some cases data agreements as well. Japan, Vietnam, Korea, Canada, the much more complicated Mercosur deal. I think it's lagged a bit on getting connectivity finance and things mobilized, but again, still the prospect in the new EU budget, you'll have that. Now, I think it would be better, clearly, if you had kind of clearer and tougher language from the EU and China in general. But as Frank mentioned, I think you saw that moving in a very different direction, including the remarks from von der Leyen this week. It would be better if you were able to threaten sanctions over Xinjiang and Hong Kong, French and British presence operations in the South China Sea, naval cooperation in the Indo-Pacific is all very useful. And yes, there are still a lot of these kind of big battles being fought out over China policy in Europe. But I think the striking thing as well in the last period of time has been that whether it's in the Bundestag or in Westminster or in the European Parliament, this kind of greater democratic engagement that you're seeing with kind of China policy issues in Europe is now pushing things in quite a different direction, is moving things harder in towards some of the kind of more robust policies that we'd want to see. But I mean, I think it's possible to come up with all sorts of measures that would pass a kind of confront China virility test that would also be completely self-defeating. And I think the big question really in the next period of time is as much going to be if competing with China effectively is, as Peter partly also suggested at the beginning, going to be really critically dependent on getting the leading democracies and economies of the world to mobilize their resources collectively, strengthen each other's capacities to act, and so on, given that, of course, as India, the EU, the US, Japan, of course, as well, in aggregate, we will continue to dwarf China on most metrics long into the future. if that's the case, I mean, I think then the kinds of instruments and platforms that the EU has been putting in place over the last period of time are still going to be a very central part of that effort. Even though I think a lot of the debates that we're still seeing and that Frank talked about, the difficulties that we have in terms of pulling together a coherent response within the EU are of course still going to be there in the next period of time.
Thanks, Andrew. I think that's a very interesting point that often from India, when we look at EU's responses, we look at EU statements on very classic China policy things. And in that process, we miss a lot of these interesting things that are happening on trade, on technology, on business, on subsidies, all these internal debates, which might not have a direct link to China per se, but will have an impact on not just EU's relationships with China, but also its partners. We'll come back to that. I think I want to bring in Mareike at this point. Since we are looking at the impact of coronavirus crisis and China, for us in Asia, we've seen a very aggressive response from the Chinese on a lot of territorial disputes from India, Japan, Taiwan, South China Sea, which have interestingly come in tandem at a time when a lot of these countries are involved and busy with their internal coronavirus responses. How is this being perceived in Europe? Of course, there's no territorial engagement and crises between Europe and China, but are there issues regarding security, Europe's integrity, where Chinese response is seen as a little bit aggressive?
Thank you, Garima, and also thank you from me to ICS and Konrad Adenauer Foundation for having me here. I think, you will know better than me that the perception of a lot of the things that are going on in Asia seem a little far away in Europe. It's been very hard to get attention, for instance, for the China-India border, well, mini invasion, really. It's a little easier to get some people to pay attention to what's been happening in Hong Kong because of UK involvement, and also because there has been enough debate and enough people are beginning to realize that, oh, well, if China is going to break a contract, a binding international treaty that's been filed with the UN 27 years ahead of schedule, what does that actually mean in terms of what kind of deals we can get with China? So that has drawn a little more attention. But other than that, I think the main concerns in Europe, even though obviously we don't have any border conflicts because we don't have a border with China, but we have, I guess we have seen a lot more concerns. You already hinted at this in the area of hybrid threats, in the area of disinformation, interference, and European policies on the part of China. And basically what happened here is I would say China really overplayed its hand. It did a lot of the things that the Chinese government has been doing in Europe in the past, but it did it against a number of countries at the same time and much more aggressively than in the past. So for instance, the first example that obviously caused a lot of concern in Europe was mass diplomacy, the very aggressive approach to push to get governments to thank China for their mass delivery that then often actually either didn't arrive or had to be fought for, or were the mass ended up being defective, and yet you got all those requests from the Chinese government to please thank China or else, or to make sure that perhaps your national policies are in line with Chinese interests or else. So there were a couple of reasonably overt threats issued. On top of that, I think a lot of governments finally woke up to the fact that the Chinese government doesn't only talk to national governments, it also inundates local governments at the state level, at the city level, with letters, and tried to get local governments to actually issue statements praising China's response in return for better access to medical equipment. And the way that the scarcity of crucial equipment was weaponized in a way, I think did not go down well in most European countries, with a couple of exceptions. I think the Italian case made slightly different because anger in Italy was more focused at the EU itself rather than at China. But by and large, this caused a lot of backlash. Then you have the issue of disinformation, which Europe had started paying attention to disinformation emanating from China, though this was really the first time recently that Europe actually called out China and listed it alongside Europe. In the past, Europe had been looking at Chinese disinformation, but was always hesitant to name and shame China in this regard, and for fear of endangering relations. But in this time again, this aggressive approach, especially by some of the diplomats. There's one guy in particular, spokesperson at the MFA, former Chinese ambassador to Pakistan, Zhao Lijian, who's kind of the wolf warrior in chief, who very aggressively distributed conspiracy theories, such as that this originated in Italy instead of in China. One of the main conspiracy theories, taking the words of Italian doctors and twisting them to make it look like this started in Italy. There was a very aggressive campaign by the Chinese embassy in France against France, twisting, claiming that French doctors had left their posts, and claiming that French lawmakers had made racist remarks, and all these things simply weren't true. And this is not something entirely new. This wolf warrior approach has existed before in Europe, but it was used very selectively against basically one or two countries. The main example is Sweden. And Sweden has been kind of trying to deal with it for a while, and Sweden was never quite sure how to handle it and whether to get support from the European Union. The European Union was never quite sure what to do about that either. But this time around, it didn't just hit Sweden, a country which might choose to shut up, but actually hit a couple of major European countries that decided not to shut up about it. So we had this which to me is quite remarkable, that the EU came out after the mini summit, the video summit, to actually give a contrasting statement. Because in the past, what I've always seen with these dialogues is China and the European side meet, whether that is at the EU level or whether that's at country level, then usually the Chinese side will put out a report afterwards in which it talks about, European diplomats praising China and talking about how everybody is on board on everything. And it's kind of the first time for such a large event that there's been major pushback. Now, whether or not this will last, it's unclear. I think if it will last, it will not be because of this single episode, but it will be because this is bound to continue in some form or another, because obviously we are in no shape or form over this crisis yet. This is going to be with us for a number of years, really. So I think I do think it's going to have a lasting effect on the relationship, but primarily because of this long-lasting effect. Maybe one last thing that I want to say, because we tend to think of in Europe obstacles to a tougher China policy. We tend to look at, countries like Greece, like Hungary, like Italy. We tend to look south and east. I think this really puts the blame a little wrongly, because I think when I think of obstacles to tougher China policies, I actually think of the major European countries whose economies are a lot more invested and a lot more dependent on the Chinese market, principally Germany. Germany obviously likes to think of itself as we're driving this tough on China policy, perhaps, but I think it's really more of an obstacle, because right now German industry is, of course, panicking about what's going to happen to the Chinese market and what they're going to do economically. So if I see any obstacles to better, more united, tougher China policy, I see that in Germany.
Great. Thank you so much, Mareike, for those very interesting remarks. We've had the scene set by our three panelists. As Frank mentioned, the overall discourse tone, tenor of Europe on China is changing. Andrew hinted towards all the different policy instruments that the EU is using, whether it is 5G, trade, tech, businesses, subsidies. A lot of these were places where pushback to China is apparent. And Mareike very clearly outlined the discourse that has changed, the whole disinformation question, looking at China as a potential threat to European integrity, going beyond the usual north-south, east-west ruptures, but really something that we see across the board. I see a lot of people have already started asking questions. For the Q&A, I'd like to first invite our print partners for today, our media partners for today, from the print. Jyoti, the floor is yours for the first round of questions.
Garima, thank you so much for this. And once again, I'd like to thank Ambassador Shokanta for the Prince partnership with the ICS. I have two quick questions. The first is for Mareike, just to take up on your last line, Mareike, actually, where you said that German industry is panicking over what could potentially be a distancing between, say, the European Union or specifically Germany and China. How is your government, how is Germany, or how is the government, and how is the EU going to react to this? Because if your wealth, if a large part of your wealth comes from China, then how do you deal with that, especially if you temper relations? And my second question is to all of you, to Andrew Small as well as to Frank Beaker, which is the clashes in Ladakh between the Indian soldiers and PLA, and you refer to them, Garima. How does Europe look at that?
Should I start? So what is happening there? I can mainly perhaps speak for the German perspective. Of course, there are attempts to mend relations. Our Chancellor Angela Merkel has come out, I think, on a number of issues, including Hong Kong specifically, saying that Germany isn't going to do too much on that because we have an interest in preserving good relations with China. So she was actually quite open about that, shooting against that. I know that a number of high-profile German companies have negotiated a deal with the Chinese government that their managers can fly back, even as Chinese nationals around the world aren't even allowed or don't have the opportunity to fly back into China. So you see some concrete efforts to make sure that not everything breaks off and that you get people back into the country. And obviously, the Chinese side is interested in that as well, because the Chinese government is also seeing what is happening. So they're willing to grant, I guess, German business preferred access. I don't even know that this is necessarily a question of the entire German economy being extremely dependent on China. There are some studies that suggest that the actual dependence is actually much lower. But the thing is, some specific sectors, such as automotive and some other industries, are highly dependent on China, and they perhaps have a larger political influence than, say, small and mid-sized German businesses. So it really remains to be seen how this plays out, the pressure between industrial pressure and the overall thrust in Europe as a whole to take a more critical stance. That is definitely something that is also on my radar to watch, how that's going to play out in Germany specifically.
I'll comment on the second, but I hesitate slightly given that the vantage point that Mareike has in Berlin and that Frank had as well on the German industry question. But I would still like to just add one thing on that, which is, I mean, the interesting dynamic with, for instance, what we've seen, as I mentioned in the response to Garima's question, is how important a role industry has really played in some of the shifts that we've seen. German industry in particular, really an intellectual leadership role. This term systemic rival that the EU has been using, I mean, really in a sense came from the systemic competition term that the BDI laid out. And the interesting thing with the BDI process was the German firms that were pushing for a kind of toughening up of the EU approach to the greatest extent were some of those that had the biggest economic interests in China, that were closest to China, that had the greatest exposure. It didn't mean they weren't going to continue to pursue their own market opportunities and things, but it did mean that they were most aware of precisely the risks that were underway in the long term, and the need at the EU level, where they're not necessarily going to be blamed for the measures that are put in place, to toughen up the instruments. So a lot of the things that I kind of mentioned in my comments in terms of the hardening of the approach on lots of respects in the European side. Again, lots of the critical individuals and voices and views on that are also coming from German industry. So I would just kind of add that as a caveat to that there are countervailing elements, and there are kind of there is certainly on certain issues this kind of impetus in other directions, but it's quite a complex picture what the role that some of these industrial interests play in this. On the China-India border question, I think the challenge on the European side is that it's not, I wouldn't say it's necessarily yet been seen as just another manifestation of the Chinese behavior that we've seen across the board. I mean, I think there's clearly debates, including in India, about how to interpret what's going on at the border. Is this of a piece with what's going on in Hong Kong, Taiwan, South China Sea, wolf warrior diplomacy, a general pushing out, which I tend to think that it is and should be seen through that prism. But the tendency has been for China-India border questions to be seen as, carefully managed between the two sides, not something that involves outside parties, very specific to the dynamics in the specific terrain at the particular time of year, all of these sorts of things. So I think in some respects, it will also depend on heightened clarity, including from the Indian government even on this at points, to say this is different. This means that this should be interpreted in a different light. And we've certainly heard that from a lot of prominent figures in India. But I think there's going to be a question of how far this messaging is kind of pushed to Europe in the next stretch. Because, I mean, when we're talking about watershed moments with the pandemic, whether this is a watershed moment for India's China policy, I don't think there is a presumption in Europe, certainly in terms of, what we saw with Doklam and past instances, that it would necessarily represent that. The understanding is quite weak, I would say. But I think if there is kind of more of a concerted push to say, India's China policy is, for instance, going to be fundamentally rebalanced as a result of this, then people will look at this in a different light.
Frank, would you like to come in at this point on these questions?
Not really. I don't have anything really major to add to this. Just one or two things. First of all, that the issue of what happened in Ladakh is indeed something that foreshadows Chinese more strategic and aggressive behavior across the world. And Hong Kong, Andrew pulled in Hong Kong, quite rightly so. That awareness isn't here. In fact, in many European countries, awareness of the Indian-China relationship is very limited to begin with. But it also touches on the bigger issue for Europe, which we haven't really started thinking about, although I think Peter Wimmerle mentioned it, and that is an alliance of the willing. If India does indeed increasingly gets to feel the brunt of China's strategic agenda, then that may be a way of arguing more forcefully for such an alliance of the willing. The only mistake that often is made, and it's a very natural one because I'm making it myself as well, is to think of this as a systemic issue. So democracies versus authoritarian countries. I think that would be a wrong way of looking at it. We should be thinking about it more sort of clear-headed as how do we deal with a rising superpower quite regardless of its political system. And then an alliance, if we want to forge such an alliance, should also in principle include other countries that are not necessarily fully democratic, but which share the interests of keeping China in check, if you can at all, with us. Thinking of it as simply democracy versus authoritarianism will, I think, send us down the wrong, in the wrong direction.
Thanks, Frank. And Jyoti, to your question, just to add to what Andrew was saying, looking at the media coverage in Europe of the Ladakh crisis, India-China border, there's a lot of both sides must restrain, both sides must do this. It's very complicated. Even us in India, we're looking at different maps and everybody is talking about fingers and it's very hard to understand what exactly is going on. But here, I think strategic messaging becomes really important. A lot of German and other newspapers quoted Global Times and they quoted the Chinese Foreign Ministry statement simply because in the news cycle, they were the first ones to put it out. I think it's also in the sense of how we are managing our strategic messaging and that's the point that Andrew made too. For a lot of commentators in Europe who do not understand what is going on at the border, it's a complicated mess to untangle. And here having a clear messaging from our side would also perhaps help in shaping how the narrative is developing on this question. Staying on the topic, I see a couple of people have asked the question, will European Asia policy now expand beyond China? A lot of people have the impression that Europe has put all its proverbial eggs in the China basket. And does Europe have a role to play in the Indo-Pacific? How is the whole Indo-Pacific idea being seen in Europe? Would you like to comment on that question before we open the floor? Andrew, perhaps?
Sure. So, I mean, I think there was already a move some time ago to say European policy in Asia was excessively China-centric, that at the economic level and at the political level and at the security level, there needed to be a kind of substantial push beyond that. And if you trace visits by European prime ministers, presidents to the region over a 15-year period, you have a period where it's all China, a couple of other places. And then there's this big rebalancing. And yes, the China thing is still there, but there's been quite a qualitative shift in terms of just the political engagement. It is still China-centric, but kind of much less so than it used to be. And I think the trade thing the trade agenda has been, I mean, the European trade agenda in Asia has been described by some people as Asia -1, i.e. you're not going to be able to do an FTA with China. It would be a bad idea if you did. But almost everyone else should be in play for this. And if you look at and the EU is, of course, in negotiations with virtually every country, or has concluded deals with virtually every country in the region. I think that there will be continued and renewed interest, again, in light of what's going on what that might look like with India, which has been one of the more kind of difficult cases. But I think if you look at what's been going on with Japan in particular, which I think was a really kind of crux deal for everything that's been going on. I mean, that not just the free trade deal, but the data sharing agreement, which I think is seen as very important in Europe as well, which is the biggest data kind of pooling capacity that now exists. That's already happened. I think the security piece has been somewhat less, with the exception France has a very distinct and specific role that it plays, and I think its Indo-Pacific strategy has been kind of at the leading edge of what's been going on in Europe in that regard. And we have kind of seen kind of stepping up in various elements there, clearly in terms of the partnerships with countries in the region, defense cooperation, defense technology cooperation, all the deals that have been made, the new agreements that have been reached with India in particular, I would note in that regard. And then I think the other critical piece in the Indo-Pacific is the connectivity finance question, where I think if the Indo-Pacific is also understood as partly the agenda of how do you compete more effectively with the Belt and Road and some of these sorts of things, then there has been more impetus, particularly with this Europe-Asia connectivity strategy, to look at how do you mobilize resources on the European side. In principle, Europe has as large a pool of finance as could be mobilized to do this as anyone. The European officials have talked about being able to sort of put hundreds of billions of dollars in new resources in play, mobilizing partly private finance for that as well. That would be a really major element of whatever an Indo-Pacific agenda and wider agenda in the region looks like. They still haven't got that money properly in place yet. It's still been one of the kind of lagging features on the European side. But I also think, I mean, just lastly, coming out of any kind of how do you rebalance your China strategy and things, I certainly see from senior European officials and things, there needs to be even more impetus on the rest of Asia agenda. And to some extent, as Frank said, that's not just democratic Asia. Vietnam is actually quite important to all of this as well. And I think is seen as the kind of top high standard trade deal that the EU has done with a developing country. But I think there is going to be a lot more of the kind of attention, political resources, commitment of energy and financial resources and attention to the non-China bits of Asia, as partly for China-related reasons, but partly for intrinsic reasons. There's very good reasons to deepen ties with ASEAN, with India. Japan's a critical partner, and so I think a lot of that's going to move ahead on an even more serious basis now in the aftermath of the crisis.
And from what we're hearing, it sounds like France and Germany together are pushing for a EU response to Indo-Pacific. Might not be a strategy in itself, but at least a response. It would be interesting to see how that develops. Let's now open the floor for questions. If you have a question, please either use the raise your hand function or write your name in the chat box. I see a lot of you have already done that. I'll try to get as many questions in as possible. We'll start with Ambassador Wadhwa.
Very much, thank you. I actually did put this question on the chat, and let me just repeat that here. It's for any of the panelists who would care to answer this. I just wanted to know, is there a common realization in Europe that China has used all means possible to access high tech from Europe and is actually aiming to dominate, to patent, and to sell back technology to Europe and the rest of the world? Is Europe united on this front, or will China be able to continue to divide Europe through the 17+1 mechanism and by offering to fund infrastructure projects in selected countries in Europe and using them to its advantage? Thank you.
Would anyone like to come in on that question?
Sure, I don't mind saying a few things about this. I would think that this is actually one of the areas of European policy that is potentially the most promising. There is a widely shared realization that China is indeed shopping around in Europe for high tech, and businesses that control or develop such high tech. Also, that relationships of research and development between universities, for instance, are not necessarily innocent, but do sometimes serve strategic agendas that we want to oppose. So there is a rising awareness of this, particularly in the last two and a half years. There is now also talk at the EU level of actually coordinating this kind of policy to look at what could be done from a screening mechanism for research and development projects. So I think this is actually an area where the European Union and individual European countries can work together quite effectively. It does play to a certain extent to the strengths of the EU in terms of putting together clear regulations, clear rules that are then rolled out across Europe to deal with China in this way that will help us fend off their shopping behavior.
Thank you. Any other comments, Andrew, Mareike, at this stage?
I'd just add on the 5G question has been kind of a wake-up call as well in some respects. I mean, it's been. I mean, the second part of your question, kind of, how far are there still splits on this question? There has been it's been a difficult process getting to a place on the telecom side of appreciating what's at stake, not just as a sort of internal European security question, but precisely as you frame it, a kind of long-term global technology competition question. It was not understood through that prism by a number of the countries that were dealing with it. It was seen as a kind of technical other back doors that Huawei can use and things like that. I think the debate has moved further towards a view that says it's one of the areas in which Europe does actually have champions in the telecom side. And if the kind of hardwiring of the digital economy around the world becomes centered around Chinese firms, then there's going to be a problem on almost all counts: industrial problem for an economic problem for Europe, and then all of the kind of the values elements that are bound up in various elements of Chinese technology usage as well are going to have a detrimental effect if Europe doesn't compete seriously. I still think it's not quite got to where it needs to get, particularly on the. I mean, we're still waiting on a couple of the critical Huawei decisions, the 5G decisions, but it's moved very, very dramatically in the last period of time, and it's been quite helpful beyond Europe. I would actually say on the American side, I think the appreciation that actually you're going to have areas in which you don't have firms in these sectors that can compete. The US side is running around right now offering finance for Ericsson and Nokia in third markets in order to ensure that European firms rather than Western firms or non-Chinese firms are able to compete. And I think on the kind of, if you're looking at industrial policy questions more broadly between countries and things, I think the 5G debate has been helpful in catalyzing more of an appreciation that it's going to have to be a joined up effort on lots of these things. It's not going to be the US alone or Europe alone in doing this. But I think we're still not quite there yet on some of this. And the UK decision was a really important one in the last period of time, but even in Germany, we're still waiting for the final cut on this, for instance. And so I think there's still some, and it's going to have quite a critical effect on where all of this comes out.
Thank you, Andrew. I'd like to bring in Ambassador Puri at this point. Very nice to have you on the panel. Since you were our ambassador to the EU, perhaps you have a comment on how things have changed since you were in Brussels on the China question. But I'd also like to ask you, has India capitalized on its partnership with the EU enough in this sort of changing global scenario? Vis-a-vis China, we've sort of stepped up our engagement everywhere. Do you think we've capitalized on the EU enough? So you'll have to unmute. Apologies.
Yeah, am I on?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Garima. And Ashok, I want to say thank you to you for focusing on the second largest economy in the world without the UK. It's not there in India. Garima, I hope it answers your second question straight away. Let me ask you the question that I wanted to. For me, including from India's perspective, the most important thing is, and if I use this word in reverse, the containment of China, i.e. bring them into the rules-based order and let them be part of what they are. That they are going to become the largest economy in the world is not in doubt. That's not the issue. I believe they were wrong-footed by COVID, so this is an opportunity. I believe the key issue is the US-EU divergence on taking key strategic decisions. And we are all, as a result of it, not being able to coalesce forward. It also means that in the COVID case, we were, in a sense, let me tell you, shortchanged by global leadership of the free world. What happened? As far as the EU is concerned, let me ask you, where was the ECDC? Global 24-hour monitoring of global health situation world. What did they do? What did the CDC do? So, my question goes back to all the panelists. Andrew, I want to thank you because you just mentioned the word EU and US coming together. I think that's the key issue. And that's what we must really look for. And I hope that the corona pandemic, which has really, there hasn't been anything like this at all, which has struck everyone. And without doubt, the Europeans and the Americans have been those who've taken the largest hits and now the hit in the economy. If they coalesce together, if there's political coalescing, we will all be beneficiary. Your last question, Garima. Look, we all know that India and the EU have really a large number of symmetries which can be built up. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But if a very short while, if I may say, we come close, but then the last mile connectivity, invariably something or the other comes, whether it's the Baroness-Nicholson report or inability to get through the BTIA or now the letter on the Kashmir issue to the Home Minister of India. But we need to work on it. because this is a relationship which can only benefit both sides, but there must be a recognition. There must be a recognition in the EU that India, if not arrived, is arriving. In India, there has to be a recognition that the EU, not just European countries, the EU together is an institutional arrangement which the Europeans have put together, which is for us a good instrument. And of course, we have to play along with them and take this thing forward. So thank you very much. I'm delighted to be part of this webinar.
Great, thank you. So the question on transatlantic unity, who would like to come in there in transatlantic coordination?
I can if you want to.
Yes, please.
Okay. Yeah, I'm still. I'm not as sanguine about the potential of European-US collaboration in any field, and particularly also not in the field of China policy. This has less to do with Europe and China as such, and more to do with the United States. And we can, of course, say that, yes, we now have a strange president there, and after the election, hopefully it's all going to get better. But I still have to see. The very recent US-China policy statement is full of American interests, American strategic interests. It has very little to say about any ways or forms to collaborate with any other parties in the world, let alone their interests. So this is actually a superpower that is now retreating back onto its own turf, its own interests. And is that a partner that we can then fully put all our eggs into that basket? I don't think so. I think there's a real need for Europe to be more autonomous strategically. And of course, that eventually will also have to have a military dimension. Sorry. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. Let somebody else.
I'll just say a couple of words on this. I mean, I do think it's critical. The challenge. I mean, there's two layers to the challenge. I certainly think that it's immensely difficult, as long as President Trump is in office, to be able to do a very kind of serious transatlantic agenda on China. And that will certainly be true after November as well. There have been some very discrete areas of cooperation on the transatlantic side, on some of the investment screening issues, a little bit on the connectivity side, some narrow things on trade, but it's just been inherently limited by not by, I think, the European appetite for doing this. I think European leaders had gone really directly to the administration in the early days to say, you know, we can figure out a common China agenda. There are differences in view, but there is some fundamental analysis in common. But at the highest political level, it's not been possible to get real traction on that. I mean, the line that you continue to see from President Trump, that is, the EU is worse than China, only smaller, I think has been a sort of abiding view of the higher levels of the administration. The interesting thing to me, seeing a lot of the people working on this in the White House and other parts, has been that there is a real appreciation of the role of Europe and on the EU. If you're engaged in competition with China in the economic, trade, technology space, as well as just the classic military side, then Europe and the EU is going to play a really central role. But it's going to be impossible to mobilize any serious form of cooperation on any of these fronts if you're bashing the EU with tariffs, if you're dismantling elements of the multilateral architecture, all of the things that we've seen in the last period of time. The challenge, I think, is that, I mean, the Biden team are clearly very keen to prioritize having a much more kind of ally-centered, partner-centered China policy in place. And I think doing some very thoughtful things in terms of what this might amount to in precisely all of this kind of more, not, again, it's not just going to be the classic China issues. It's how do you forge partnerships across trade, technology, a much wider set of questions. The difficulty, as Frank said, is that I think the mood on the European side has moved in such a direction that if you're looking at 3 years of difficult negotiations on a major trade and technology partnership with the US or something like this, your fear is that it's going to be upended a year later by another Trump administration or something like that. So it has become harder as a result of this to make some of the long-term bets on elements of transatlantic partnership that will be really, really important to being able to deal with the China agenda seriously. I think it's going to require a lot more from the US Congress to step in and kind of be ready to kind of tie the hands of administrations on this if you're going to have a level of trust on the European side, on the longevity of some of the commitments that might be there from the US. And there still are, of course, gaps in certain respects in views, but I mean, there will be a lot of enthusiasm for fixing the transatlantic partnership and things if you have a change of administration, and a new US administration will put China as one of the central focal points. So I think there will be some give on the European side as well on that, because I think it will be seen as kind of central to resetting things. And the US can't do this alone. EU can't do that. No one can really pursue this agenda alone. And I think the efforts that have been made unilaterally in the last couple of years, particularly on the trade front by the US, have been a real demonstration of the ineffectiveness of attempting to pursue a purely unilateral policy. Even if you go all out with 25% tariffs and all of these sorts of things, it has been a useful demonstration for a lot of people, not just the Trump kind of side of the administration, but others as well, that the US doesn't have the leverage alone on this. But if that is going to be really reflected in a rebalancing of approach, it's going to have to be much more kind of accommodating of partner concerns and things. It can't be a purely US-centric model. And I think we're going to see a big test of this in the first year or so of a new administration, if the elections go in the other way in November. If they don't, unfortunately, I think this agenda is going to be extraordinarily difficult to pursue.
Come in, Mareike, please.
Sorry. I think this has two sides. And I think on the one hand, yes, Europe's absolutely right to distrust the Trump administration, because everything that Trump has done has been counterproductive for that alliance. I mean, one of the key goals of the Chinese government is to split the transatlantic alliance. So people always ask me, well, is Trump actually the biggest asset? So I do think there is a real need on the US side to understand that this is an active goal on the Chinese side. This is a key goal of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, to split that alliance. On the other hand, I do think on a lot of things that the Trump administration has done on China, it's been simply right, and Europe has simply been wrong. And I think I may disagree with the way it's been done, but I think fundamentally it's going in the right direction. And I think Andrew has already hinted at this, there's not going to be a U-turn if Biden is elected. The US is not going to reverse policy on that. So it'll be interesting to see if that'll be good enough to get Europe on board with that, or whether there are more fundamental disagreements with actually the policy direction, which I think is fundamentally correct.
Mareike, while I have you on, there's another question from Ambassador Sajanhar, which says, the EU looks at its relations with China in silos. The trade and economic silo is more important than the political silo, which has rule of law, human rights, democracy. He argues that it is a bit marginal. Will Europe be able to evolve a comprehensive policy towards China, which sees China as a strategic adversary? I thought you might like to come in on this question.
I mean, we've already seen tremendous progress in this regard over the past 2 years. Europe calling China as a strategic rival is unprecedented. There's still this back and forth, which I do think comes from different interest groups within the EU. It really depends on how, again, the situation post-COVID is going to go, to what extent some ties can be rebuilt, to what extent also, I think right now the EU on the one hand wants to get tougher on China. On the other hand, the impression that I get, there is still this idea that they can, under the circumstances or for whatever reason, get some fundamental concessions from China. in terms of, I don't know, I mean, even pushing the investment agreement ahead that's been kind of stalling, that's been sitting there for 7 years, still trying to push that ahead. I think one of the bigger problems so far, I don't even know if the problem is siloing. To some degree, my bigger concern has been the lack of siloing. So the idea that if we come out too strongly on criticizing China on aspect A, B, and C, then we will not get the cooperation that we need with China on health, on climate, on a number of other aspects. And I think this is a fundamentally wrong approach. I think the correct approach would be to look at what are the interests of the Chinese government, what are the genuine interests, where is there actual common ground, not just where China says there is common ground, and to work on those areas and to worry less about criticizing China in other areas, because if the Chinese government is genuinely interested in cooperation, it will do it regardless. It's not going to go against its fundamental interests just because the EU puts out a statement on Hong Kong, just because the EU pushes back more strongly. Whereas if it's a project where the Chinese government to begin with isn't so interested in, where the Chinese government has very little to win, and was basically doing the Europeans a favor, that's not going to go ahead either way, regardless of how much you criticize. So I feel the problem isn't siloing. The problem is that these things are considered to be affecting each other, where really Europe has to sit back, look at the few areas where there is common ground, pursue those, and stand up more on everything else.
Thank you, Mareike. I see Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia next on my list of questions.
Thank you very much, Garima. I appreciate your giving me the opportunity. I have a broad geopolitical question. As we look from Delhi at Europe, and by Europe we mean European Union, and by EU actually we mean the key players in European Union. So first of all, Europe, as came out clearly, has quite a lot of internal stresses and strains. Secondly, EU has a serious relationship problem with the US. Thirdly, Europe has still not been able to normalize its relations with Russia. And now, to cap it all, EU has serious strains in its relations with China. So in this broader picture, may I put the question to Professor Frank Piëch to enlighten us as to what really are the broad policy options for European Union?
Easy question for Frank.
Yeah, that's a massive question. And when you lay it out like that, I mean, the only response is that is one of extreme pessimism, because we seem to have created or risen to problems without creating any opportunities. I think that the fundamental way out for Europe is to be more autonomous and work more on the basis of its interests, rather than on the basis of either perceived loyalties or perceived systemic similarities or shared ideologies or ideals. And I think that is still, that kind of realpolitik is still some way from coming within the EU and in Europe in general. For a very long time, and really since the end of the Second World War, we have been sitting on under the American security umbrella and been able to actually free ride on that and not think about the really hard choices and the really hard issues that you have to tackle if you are an autonomous, if not independent, strategic power. So ultimately, I think the only solution, but it is a little bit high in the sky, I admit, the only solution for Europe is to become more of a genuine strategic power that looks at its genuine interest, and then isn't also afraid to work with Russia, for instance, if that is necessary in particular areas. Bludgeoning Russia as the ultimate enemy is ultimately an American agenda, it's not a European agenda. And we should not be afraid to look at certain ways of working together with Russia, not across the board, of course, if that suits their own purposes. Likewise with India, likewise with China. But that will require a fundamental reset of the way that Europe, the European Union, I should say, thinks about foreign policy. So I'm not optimistic that that is going to be possible in the near future.
Since this is a broader question about EU foreign policy and we're sort of almost out of time, I'd like to invite the other two panelists also to give us final words and closing remarks before we close the session. Who would like to go first, perhaps Andrew?
So, I mean, on the very broad question, I suppose the interesting thing is all the countries that are then left off this list, and in one way they do also have, in lots of cases, things in common as well. And I think there has been this kind of sort of middle power effort effectively in the last period of time between a lot of the other actors who are then trying to figure out how to deal with certain powers that are throwing their weight around, and in varying ways undermining or diminishing commitments to the multilateral system, and figuring out how to hold a version of that together during a period of time in which the critical supporter of that kind of multilateral system has taken a very different approach, the US in the last period of time. And I think the sense is on the European side that in each instance, this has not been precipitated, these problematic relations have not been precipitated by actions taken on the European side. I mean, the annexation of Crimea, the first kind of change in borders in Europe by unilateral force is something where there's still been a willingness to hold the line that unless there's a rebalancing in the approach to Ukraine, that it's not possible to make progress there. And then the big China rethink is underway, which we've been discussing, and then the US situation is one where I think people are basically waiting to see what happens after the election, but then, as Frank somewhat suggests, planning for a scenario in which you're not going to have the version of the transatlantic partnership that used to be there. I still remember seeing a senior Japanese diplomat shortly before the last US elections talking about Japan's long-term choices as well in this regard. This was before Trump had won, and there was just this sort of panic about the fact that it was now going to be impossible to make some of these kind of long-term judgments about and commitments on the defense relationship if there was the possibility that you had a US president who might be willing to kind of tear all of this up. Japan, of course, has kind of stepped up in various ways as well in the last period of time, and with CPTPP has been kind of holding together the multilateral trade front, at least in the region. I think all of this will look very different. The entire framework will look very different if you have if you have a change in the US presidency. There is still a kind of even with parts of Europe that want to do the kind of strategic autonomy agenda, there are still other bits of Europe that I think are still very keen to put the kind of transatlantic relationship at the key, at the center of the European agenda, partly because it all looks so difficult if that's not there. It looks very difficult on the security side. It looks very difficult to defend kind of values that are not just European values, but that are a certain view of kind of universal values if you don't have the US occupying a certain sort of role. The options all start to look much more difficult. I think it's going to be much harder rethinking, and I think versions of what that strategic autonomy agenda look like will be pursued with a different kind of vigor on all sorts of fronts. Financially, the euro, I mean, there's going to be all sorts of questions that come into play differently if the election goes in a particular direction. But there will also be, if it goes the other way, there will be a lot of people that will lapse back into the, okay, some of the pressures to do this are off, and we will go back into something that looks more like a loosely democratic market-based, even if there's not always perfect overlap with this kind of coalition building effort. So I think we will see in November or December that kind of big reflection point, which will pull some of these other questions into play, including on Russia, as Macron and others have kind of put up as a kind of revisiting that might be kind of necessary in light of the new context that's emerging. But I honestly think a lot of this is going to be on hold until we have at least a little bit more clarity on what the next few years are going to look like.
Yeah, maybe to finish this. I do think, yes, there's a large role for middle powers to work together, and this is the way to go. I think both the US should rope them more in, and Europe should seek more cooperation. I quite disagree with the prospect that Europe's going to come up with its own defense, or that was raised by Frank, that Europe needs to, didn't quite amount to kicking out the United States and kicking out NATO from Europe. It didn't quite amount to that, but I don't really see that's not going to happen. I don't think it should happen, even though there is a constant debate, but I really don't see Europe putting up its own defense, even though that prospect is raised again and again. I do think Europe needs to contribute more, but within the existing framework. I do think there's a difference between Europe working with India, Europe working with Japan, and Europe working with a number of other democracies versus Europe working with Russia or with China. I do think there still is meaning to the democracy versus autocracy framework, simply in terms of how governments are run, how reliable decisions are that are made by those governments, and how much you can depend on them. Again, we will see how things go after the US elections. Either way, yes, middle powers working more together should be part of the plan, regardless of what happens to the transatlantic alliance. I think this is a good way forward that can help plan for all eventualities.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mareike. Apologies, we have a couple of questions that we will not be able to take because we're running out of time. But we've had a very rich discussion today on Europe and China in the age of coronavirus. We've had a sort of wide-ranging conversation that spanned everything from pressures on transatlantic relations to what Europe is doing, looking at the economic silo with relations with China, looking at the democracy, rule of law, that angle. What is quite interesting is, I think often in debates in India, we can miss what Europe is doing in terms of providing alternatives when it comes to connectivity, on trade, on data, a lot of these questions where China is central, because they are quite technical topics and frankly, couched in boring press releases, it's easy to miss, but these instruments are important, and these instruments must be taken into account when we look at Europe's China policy. Overall, I think in terms of European foreign policy at large, there has been a trend to look at the world through a US-China lens, look at Asia through the China lens, and look at global politics through a lens of US-China competition. It is a welcome trend, pushed by lawmakers rather than governments. We've seen sort of parliamentary coalitions coming up across Europe of working with other democracies, working with other middle powers. And I think that's an interesting trend for us to follow as we look at how European foreign policy will evolve. Middle power coalition building will also center Europe's relationships with countries like Japan, like Australia, like India, with ASEAN. Of course, this is a minor pillar of European foreign policy right now, but we'll have to see how this develops in tandem with its EU-China policy more broadly. Thank you very much to our three panelists for taking the time and joining us for this discussion. Thank you to all of you for tuning in, for asking such interesting questions, and for this engaging conversation. That's it from my side. Over to ICS, and Peter, if you want to have the last word.
Thanks, Garima. I think we'll conclude here. Thanks. I would like to again thank all the three panelists and Garima for very stimulating, scintillating dialogue that we had this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Nothing more to add. I think what we have said in the beginning, we want to share knowledge, understand things better. At least that we have achieved. And Frank mentioned some things are in the sky. The sky is the limit, but we work a little bit below.
Well, thank you very much.